Samuel. By Jack London. Margaret Hennon would have been a striking figure under any circumstances, but never more so than when I first chanced upon her, a sack of grain of fully 100 weight on her shoulder, as she walked with sure though tottering stride from the cart tail to the stable, pausing for an instant to gather strength at the foot of the steep steps that led to the grain bin. There were 4 of these steps, and she went up them, a step at a time, slowly, unwaveringly, and with so dogged certitude that it never entered my mind that her strength could fail her and let that 100-weight sack fall from the lean and withered frame that well nigh doubled under it. For she was patently an old woman, and it was her age that made me linger by the cart and watch. 6 times she went between the cart and the stable, each time with a full sack on her back, and beyond passing the time of day with me she took no notice of my presence. Then, the cart empty, she fumbled for matches and lighted a short clay pipe, pressing down the burning surface of the tobacco with a calloused and apparently nerveless thumb. The hands were noteworthy. They were large-knuckled, sinewy and malformed by labor, rimed with callous, the nails blunt and broken, and with here and there cuts and bruises, healed and healing, such as are common to the hands of hard-working men. On the back were huge, upstanding veins, eloquent of age and toil. Looking at them, it was hard to believe that they were the hands of the woman who had once been the belle of Island McGill. This last, of course, I learned later. At the time I knew neither her history nor her identity. She wore heavy man's brogans. Her legs were stockingless, and I had noticed when she walked that her bare feet were thrust into the crinkly, iron-like shoes that sloshed about her lean ankles at every step. Her figure, shapeless and waistless, was garbed in a rough man's shirt and in a ragged flannel petticoat that had once been red. But it was her face, wrinkled, withered and weather-beaten, surrounded by an aureole of unkempt and straggling wisps of greyish hair, that caught and held me. Neither drifted hair nor serried wrinkles could hide the splendid dome of a forehead, high and broad without verging in the slightest on the abnormal. The sunken cheeks and pinched nose told little of the quality of the life that flickered behind those clear blue eyes of hers. Despite the minutiae of wrinkle work that somehow failed to weazen them, her eyes were clear as a girl's, clear, outlooking, and far-seeing, and with an open and unblinking steadfastness of gaze that was disconcerting. The remarkable thing was the distance between them. It is a lucky man or woman who has the width of an eye between, but with Margaret Hennon the width between her eyes was fully that of an eye and a half. Yet so symmetrically moulded was her face that this remarkable feature produced no uncanny effect, and, for that matter, would have escaped the casual observer's notice. The mouth, shapeless and toothless, with downturned corners and lips dry and parchment-like, nevertheless lacked the muscular slackness so usual with age. The lips might have been those of a mummy, save for that impression of rigid firmness they gave. Not that they were atrophied. On the contrary, they seemed tense and set with a muscular and spiritual determination. There, and in the eyes, was the secret of the certitude with which she carried the heavy sacks up the steep steps, with never a false step or overbalance, and emptied them in the grain bin. "You are an old woman to be working like this," I ventured. She looked at me with that strange, unblinking gaze, and she thought and spoke with the slow deliberateness that characterized everything about her, as if well aware of an eternity that was hers and in which there was no need for haste. Again I was impressed by the enormous certitude of her. In this eternity that seemed so indubitably hers, there was time and to spare for safe footing and stable equilibrium, for certitude, in short. No more in her spiritual life than in carrying the 100 weights of grain was there a possibility of a misstep or an overbalancing. The feeling produced in me was uncanny. Here was a human soul that, save for the most glimmering of contacts, was beyond the humanness of me. And the more I learned of Margaret Hennon in the weeks that followed, the more mysteriously remote she became. She was as alien as a far journey from some other star, and no hint could she nor all the countryside give me of what forms of living, what heats of feeling, or rules of philosophic contemplation actuated her in all that she had been and was. "I will be 72 come Good Friday a fortnight," she said in reply to my question. "But you are an old woman to be doing this man's work, and a strong man's work at that," I insisted. Again she seemed to immerse herself in that atmosphere of contemplative eternity, and so strangely did it affect me that I should not have been surprised to have awaked a century or so later and found her just beginning to enunciate her reply. The work has told be done, and I am beholden told no one. But have you no children, no family, relations? Oh, I, ate plenty o' them, but they no see fut told be help on me. She drew out her pipe for a moment, then added, with a nod of her head toward the house, I love wath myself. I glanced at the house, straw-thatched and commodious, at the large stable, and at the large array of fields I knew must belong with the place. It is a big bit of land for you to farm by yourself. Oh, aye, a bug but, 70 acres. Ut kept me old mon busy, along with a son and a hired mon, tull say naught o extra hons un the harvest and a maid servant un the house. She clambered into the cart, gathered the reins in her hands, and quizzed me with her keen, shrewd eyes. Belike ye hail from over the water Amaruki, and Mayanan? Yes, I'm a Yankee, I answered. Ye will no be fin dun Moni Island McGill folk stop hun un Amaruki? No, I don't remember ever meeting one, in the States. She nodded her head. They are home-loven bodies, though I will no be saying they are no fair-travelled. Yet they come home at the last, their mounts are no lost at sea or colt by fevers and such like un foreign parts. Then your sons will have gone to sea and come home again? I queried. Oh, aye, all Savin Samuel ounce was drowned. At the mention of Samuel I could have sworn to a strange light in her eyes, and it seemed to me, as by some telepathic flash, that I divined in her a tremendous wistfulness, an immense yearning. It seemed to me that here was the key to her inscrutableness, the clue that if followed properly would make all her strangeness plain. It came to me that here was a contact and that for the moment I was glimpsing into the soul of her. The question was tickling on my tongue, but she forestalled me. She tchk'd to the horse, and with a good day told you, sir, drove off. A simple, homely people are the folk of Island McGill, and I doubt if a more sober, thrifty, and industrious folk is to be found in all the world. Meeting them abroad, and to meet them abroad one must meet them on the sea, for a hybrid seafaring and farmer breed are they, one would never take them to be Irish. Irish they claim to be, speaking of the north of Ireland with pride and sneering at their Scottish brothers, yet Scotch they undoubtedly are, transplanted Scotch of long ago, it is true, but none the less Scotch, with 1,000 traits, to say nothing of their tricks of speech and woolly utterance, which nothing less than their Scotch clannishness could have preserved to this late day. A narrow loch, scarcely half a mile wide, separates Island McGill from the mainland of Ireland, and, once across this loch, one finds himself in an entirely different country. The Scotch impression is strong, and the people, to commence with, are Presbyterians. When it is considered that there is no public house in all the island and that 7,000 souls dwell therein, some idea may be gained of the temperateness of the community. Wedded to old ways, public opinion and the ministers are powerful influences, while fathers and mothers are revered and obeyed as in few other places in this modern world. Courting lasts never later than 10 at night, and no girl walks out with her young man without her parents' knowledge and consent. The young men go down to the sea and sow their wild oats in the wicked ports, returning periodically, between voyages, to live the old intensive morality, to court till 10 o'clock, to sit under the minister each Sunday, and to listen at home to the same stern precepts that the elders preached to them from the time they were laddies. Much they learned of women in the ends of the earth, these seafaring sons, yet a canny wisdom was theirs and they never brought wives home with them. The one solitary exception to this had been the schoolmaster, who had been guilty of bringing a wife from half a mile the other side of the loch. For this he had never been forgiven, and he rested under a cloud for the remainder of his days. At his death the wife went back across the loch to her own people, and the blot on the escutcheon of Island McGill was erased. In the end, the sailor men married girls of their own homeland and settled down to become exemplars of all the virtues for which the island was noted. Island McGill was without a history. She boasted none of the events that go to make history. There had never been any wearing of the green, any Fenian conspiracies, any land disturbances. There had been but one eviction, and that purely technical, a test case, and on advice of the tenant's lawyer. So Island McGill was without annals. History had passed her by. She paid her taxes, acknowledged her crowned rulers, and left the world alone. All she asked in return was that the world should leave her alone. The world was composed of two parts, Island McGill and the rest of it. And whatever was not Island McGill was outlandish and barbarian, and well she knew, for did not her seafaring sons bring home report of that world and its ungodly ways? It was from the skipper of a Glasgow tramp, as passenger from Colombo to Rangoon, that I had first learned of the existence of Island McGill, and it was from him that I had carried the letter that gave me entrance to the house of Mrs. Ross, widow of a master mariner, with a daughter living with her and with two sons, master mariners themselves and out upon the sea. Mrs. Ross did not take in boarders, and it was Captain Ross's letter alone that had enabled me to get from her bed and board. In the evening, after my encounter with Margaret Hennon, I questioned Mrs. Ross, and I knew on the instant that I had in truth stumbled upon mystery. Like all Island McGill folk, as I was soon to discover, Mrs. Ross was at first averse to discussing Margaret Hennon at all. Yet it was from her I learned that evening that Margaret Hennon had once been one of the island belles. Herself the daughter of a well-to-do farmer, she had married Thomas Hennon, equally well-to-do. Beyond the usual housewife's tasks she had never been accustomed to work. Unlike many of the island women, she had never lent a hand in the fields. But what of her children? I asked. Two other sons, Jamie and Timothy Usey married and began Tull C. Thought Bughouse Close Tull the post office Usey Jamies. The daughters thought Harno married be Leuven Watham as Dud marry. And the rest be dead. The Samuels, Clara interpolated, with what I suspected was a giggle. She was Mrs. Ross's daughter, a strapping young woman with handsome features and remarkably handsome black eyes. "'Twas naught to be smucker or not," her mother reproved her. "The Samuels," I intervened. "I don't understand." "Her 4 sons thought died." "And were they all named Samuel?" "Aye." "Strange," I commented in the lagging silence. "Very strange," Mrs. Ross affirmed, proceeding stolidly with the knitting of the woolen singlet on her knees, one of the countless undergarments that she interminably knitted for her skipper sons. "And it was only the Samuels that died?" I queried, in further attempt. "The others loved," was the answer. "A fine family, no finer on the island. No better lods ever sailed out of Island McGill. The minister held them up ounce models Tull Potten after. Nor was ever a whisper breathed again the girls." "But why is she left alone now in her old age?" I persisted. "Why don't her own flesh and blood look after her? Why does she live alone? Don't they ever go to see her or care for her?" "Never a one UN 20 years and more now. She fetched UT on Tull herself. She drove them from the house just ounce she drove old Tom Hennon, thought was her husband, Tull whose death." "Drink?" I ventured. Mrs. Ross shook her head scornfully, as if drink was a weakness beneath the weakest of Island McGill. A long pause followed, during which Mrs. Ross knitted stolidly on, only nodding permission when Clara's young man, mate on one of the Shire Line sailing ships, came to walk out with her. I studied the half-dozen ostrich eggs, hanging in the corner against the wall like a cluster of some monstrous fruit. On each shell were painted precipitous and impossible seas through which full-rigged ships foamed with a lack of perspective only equalled by their sharp technical perfection. On the mantelpiece stood 2 large pearl shells, obviously a pair, intricately carved by the patient hands of New Caledonian convicts. In the center of the mantel was a stuffed bird of paradise, while about the room were scattered gorgeous shells from the southern seas, delicate sprays of coral sprouting from barnacled pipi shells encased in glass, assegais from South Africa, stone axes from New Guinea, huge Alaskan tobacco pouches beaded with heraldic totem designs, a boomerang from Australia, divers' ships in glass bottles, a cannibal kai bowl from the Marquesas, and fragile cabinets from China and the Indies and inlaid with mother-of-pearl and precious woods. I gazed at this varied trove brought home by sailor sons, and pondered the mystery of Margaret Hennon, who had driven her husband to his death and been forsaken by all her kin. It was not the drink. Then what was it? Some shocking cruelty? Some amazing infidelity? Or some fearful, old-world peasant crime? I broached my theories, but to all Mrs. Ross shook her head. "Ut was no thought," she said. "Margaret was a good wife and a good mother, and I doubt she would harm a fly. She brought up her family God-fearing and decent-minded. Her trouble was thought she took lunatic, turned idiot." Mrs. Ross tapped significantly on her forehead to indicate a state of addlement. "But I talked with her this afternoon," I objected, "and I found her a sensible woman, remarkably bright for one of her years." "Aye, and I'm granton all thought you say," she went on calmly. "But I am no refer until thought. I am refer until her wucked-headed and vicious stubbornness. No more stubborn woman ever loved than Margaret Hennon. Ut was all on account o' Samuel, which was the name o' her youngest and they do say her favourite brother, Humounts died by whose own hand all through the ministers mustake no register in the new church at Dublin. Ut was a lesson thought the name was misfortunate, but she would no take Ut, and there was talk when she called her first child Samuel, thought died o' the croup. And Wuff thought what does she do but call the next one Samuel, and only 3 when he fell till the tub o' hot water and was plain cooked till death. Ut all come, I tell you, o' her wucked-headed and foolish stubbornness. For a Samuel she must have, and Ut was the death of the 4 of her sons. After the first, dudna her own mother go down the dirt tull her feet, a beg gun and plead on with her no tull name her next one Samuel. But she was no tull be turned from her purpose. Margaret Hennon was always set on her ways, and never more so thon on thought name Samuel. She was fair lunatic on Samuel. Dudna her neighbours and all couth and cooan savin them thought loved in the house with her, get up and walk out at the christening of the second thought was cooked. Thought they dud, and at the very moment the minister asked what would the bairn's name be. "Samuel," says she, and Wuff thought they got up and walked out and left the house. And at the door dudna her Aunt Fanny, her mother soused her, turn and say loud for all tull hear, "What for will she be want to and tull murder the wee thing?" The minister heard fine, and dudna like Ut, but, ounce he told my Larry afterward, what could he do? Ut was the woman's wish, and there was no law again a mother calling her child accordin' tull her wish. And then was there no the 3rd Samuel? And when he was lost at sea off the Cape, dudna she break all laws o' nature tull have a 4th? She was 47, I'm tellin' ye, and she had a child at 47. Thank on Ut. At 47. Ut was fair scandalous. From Clara, next morning, I got the tale of Margaret Hennon's favourite brother, and from here and there, in the week that followed, I pieced together the tragedy of Margaret Hennon. Samuel Dundee had been the youngest of Margaret's 4 brothers, and, as Clara told me, she had well nigh worshipped him. He was going to sea at the time, skipper of one of the sailing ships of the Bank Line, when he married Agnes Hewitt. She was described as a slender wisp of a girl, delicately featured and with a nervous organization of the supersensitive order. Theirs had been the first marriage in the new church, and after a 2 weeks honeymoon Samuel had kissed his bride goodbye and sailed in command of the Loftbank, a big 4-masted bark. And it was because of the new church that the minister's blunder occurred. Nor was it the blunder of the minister alone, as one of the elders later explained, for it was equally the blunder of the whole presbytery of Coughlin, which included 15 churches on Island McGill and the mainland. The old church, beyond repair, had been torn down and the new one built on the original foundation. Looking upon the foundation stones as similar to a ship's keel, it never entered the minister's nor the presbytery's head that the new church was legally any other than the old church. And 3 couples was married the first week you in the new church, Clara said. First of all, Samuel Dundee and Agnes Hewitt, the next day Albert Mahan and Minnie Duncan, and by the weekend Eddie Troy and Flo McIntosh, all sailormen, and UN 6 weeks time the last of them back told their ships in a war, and no one o' them dre mean of the wickedness they'd been at. The imp of the perverse must have chuckled at the situation. All things favoured. The marriages had taken place in the first week of May, and it was not till 3 months later that the minister, as required by law, made his quarterly report to the civil authorities in Dublin. Promptly came back the announcement that his church had no legal existence, not being registered according to the law's demands. This was overcome by prompt registration, but the marriages were not to be so easily remedied. The 3 sailor husbands were away, and their wives, in short, were not their wives. But the minister was no for alarm in the bodies, said Clara. He kept his counsel and bided whose time, why tune for the Lod's tull be back from sea. Ounce luck would have ut, he was away across the island Tulla Christenon when Albert Mahan arrives home unexpected, whose ship just docked at Dublin. Ut's 9 o'clock at night when the minister, UN whose sluppers and dressing gown, gets the news. Up he jumps and calls for horse and saddle, and away he goes like the wind for Albert Mahan's. Albert Uzi just gown told bed and has one shoe off when the minister arrives. Come with me, the pair o' ye, says he, breathless like. What for, and me dead weary and gown told bed, says Albert. You'll be lawful married, says the minister. Albert looks black and says, now, minister, ye will be jokin', but tell himself, ance I've heard him tell mony a time, he usie wonder and thought the minister should ha' took tell wosky ot whose time o' life. We be no married, says Minnie. He shook his head. And I am no Mrs. Mahan. No, says he, ye are no Mrs. Mahan. Ye are plain Mus Duncan. But ye married us yoursale, says she. I dud and I dudna, says he. And Wuff thought he tells them the whole upshot, and Albert puts on his shoe, and they go with the minister and are married proper and lawful, and ounce Albert Mahan says afterward mony's the time, to's no every mon thought hos 2 wed done nights on Island McGill. 6 months later Eddie Troy came home and was promptly remarried. But Samuel Dundee was away on a 3-year voyage and his ship fell overdue. Further to complicate the situation, a baby boy, past 2 years old, was waiting for him in the arms of his wife. The months passed, and the wife grew thin with worrying. Ut's know myself I'm thunkin' on, she is reported to have said many times, but Ut's the pure fatherless bairn. I thought happened told Samuel where will the bairn stond. Lloyd's posted the Loftbank as missing, and the owner ceased the monthly remittance of Samuel's half-pay to his wife. It was the question of the child's legitimacy that preyed on her mind, and, when all hope of Samuel's return was abandoned, she drowned herself and the child in the loch. And here enters the greater tragedy. The Loftbank was not lost. By a series of sea disasters and delays too interminable to relate, she had made one of those long, unsighted passages such as occur once or twice in half a century. How the imp must have held both his sides. Back from the sea came Samuel, and when they broke the news to him something else broke somewhere in his heart or head. Next morning they found him where he had tried to kill himself across the grave of his wife and child. Never in the history of Island McGill was there so fearful a deathbed. He spat in the minister's face and reviled him, and died blaspheming so terribly that those that tended on him did so with averted gaze and trembling hands. And, in the face of all this, Margaret Hennon named her first child Samuel. How account for the woman's stubbornness? Or was it a morbid obsession that demanded a child of hers should be named Samuel? Her third child was a girl, named after herself, and the fourth was a boy again. Despite the strokes of fate that had already bereft her, and despite the loss of friends and relatives, she persisted in her resolve to name the child after her brother. She was shunned at church by those who had grown up with her. Her mother, after a final appeal, left her house with the warning that if the child was so named she would never speak to her again. And though the old lady lived 30-odd years longer, she kept her word. The minister agreed to christen the child any name but Samuel, and every other minister on Island McGill refused to christen it by the name she had chosen. There was talk on the part of Margaret Hennon of going to law at the time, but in the end she carried the child to Belfast and there had it christened Samuel. And then nothing happened. The whole island was confuted. The boy grew and prospered. The schoolmaster never ceased averring that it was the brightest lad he had ever seen. Samuel had a splendid constitution, a tremendous grip on life. To everybody's amazement, he escaped the usual run of childish afflictions. Measles, whooping cough, and mumps knew him not. He was armor-clad against germs, immune to all disease. Headaches and earaches were things unknown. Never so much ounce a boil or a pumple, as one of the old bodies told me, ever marred his healthy skin. He broke school records in scholarship and athletics, and whipped every boy of his size or years on Island McGill. It was a triumph for Margaret Hennon. This paragon was hers, and it bore the cherished name. With the one exception of her mother, friends and relatives drifted back and acknowledged that they had been mistaken, though there were old crones who still abided by their opinion and who shook their heads ominously over their cups of tea. The boy was too wonderful to last. There was no escaping the curse of the name his mother had wickedly laid upon him. The young generation joined Margaret Hennon in laughing at them, but the old crones continued to shake their heads. Other children followed. Margaret Hennon's fifth was a boy, whom she called Jamie, and in rapid succession followed 3 girls, Alice, Sarah, and Nora, the boy Timothy, and 2 more girls, Florence and Katie. Katie was the last and 11th, and Margaret Hennon, at 35, ceased from her exertions. She had done well by Island McGill and the Queen. 9 healthy children were hers. All prospered. It seemed her ill luck had shot its bolt with the deaths of her first 2. 9 lived, and one of them was named Samuel. Jamie elected to follow the sea, though it was not so much a matter of election as compulsion, for the eldest sons on Island McGill remained on the land, while all other sons went to the salt ploughing. Timothy followed Jamie, and by the time the latter had got his first command, a steamer in the Bay trade out of Cardiff, Timothy was mate of a big sailing ship. Samuel, however, did not take kindly to the soil. The farmer's life had no attraction for him. His brothers went to sea, not out of desire, but because it was the only way for them to gain their bread, and he, who had no need to go, envied them when, returned from far voyages, they sat by the kitchen fire, and told their bold tales of the wonderlands beyond the sea rim. Samuel became a teacher, much to his father's disgust, and even took extra certificates, going to Belfast for his examinations. When the old master retired, Samuel took over his school. Secretly, however, he studied navigation, and it was Margaret's delight when he sat by the kitchen fire, and, despite their master's tickets, tangled up his brothers in the theoretics of their profession. Tom Hennon alone was outraged when Samuel, school teacher, gentleman, and heir to the Hennon farm, shipped to sea before the mast. Margaret had an abiding faith in her son's star, and whatever he did she was sure was for the best. Like everything else connected with his glorious personality, there had never been known so swift a rise as in the case of Samuel. Barely with 2 years' sea experience before the mast, he was taken from the forecastle and made a provisional second mate. This occurred in a fever port on the west coast, and the committee of skippers that examined him agreed that he knew more of the science of navigation than they had remembered or forgotten. 2 years later he sailed from Liverpool, mate of the Starry Grace, with both master's and extra master's tickets in his possession. And then it happened, the thing the old crones had been shaking their heads over for years. It was told me by Gavin McNabb, BOSN of the Starry Grace at the time, himself an Island McGill man. Well, do I remember UT, he said. We was running our eastern down, and Marcoon heavy weather of UT ounce fine a sailor mon ounce ever walked was Samuel Hennon. I remember the look of Hummel thought last marnun, a watch you and them bugsies curlin' up astern, and a watch on the old girl and seein' how she took them, the scupper down below and drunken 4 days. UT was at 7 thought Hennon brought her up on Toll the Wound, not Darren Toll run longer on thought fearful sea. At 8, after having breakfast, he turns UN, and a half hour after up comes the scupper, bleary-eyed and shaky and holdin' on Toll the companion. UT was fair smokin', I am tellin' ye, and there he stood, blunkin' and nod done and talkin' Toll hum sail. Keep off, says he at last Toll the mon at the wheel. My God, says the second mate, stand done beside hum. The scupper never looks Toll hum at all, but keeps on mutterin' and jabberin' Toll hum sail. All of a sudden like he straightens up and throws his head back, and says, put your wheel over, me mon, now dom ye. Are ye deef thought you'll no be here on me? UT was a drunken mon's luck, for the starry grace wore off afore thought God almighty gale what out shop in a bucket o' water, the second mate shoutin' orders in the crew jumpin' like mod. And Wuff thought the scupper nods contented like Toll himself and goes below after more whisky. UT was plain murder o' the lives o' all of us, for UT was no the time for the buggest shup afloat Toll be run none. Run? Never have I seen the like. UT was beyond all thunkin', and me gown Toll see, boy and men, for 40 year. I tell you UT was fair awesome. The face o' the second mate was white ounce death, and he stood UT alone for half an hour, when UT was too much for hum and he went below and called Samuel in the third. Aye, a fine sailor mon thought Samuel, but UT was too much for hum. He looked and studied, but he could no see whose way. He durst na heave Toll. She would ha been sweepet o' all hons and stucks and everything afore she could a fetched up. There was naught Toll do but keep on run none. Enough UT worsened we were lost one way, for soon or late that overtaken sea was sure Toll sweep us clear over poop and all. Did I say UT was a God almighty gale? UT was worse nor thought. The devil himself must ha had a hond un the bruin o UT was thought fearsome. I ha looked on some sights, but I am no Karen Toll look on the like o thought again. No mon dared Toll be un whose bunk. No, nor no mon on the decks. All hons of us stood on top the house and held on and watched. The 3 mates was on the poop, with 2 men at the wheel, and the only mon below was thought wusky blighted captain snorin' drunk. And then I see UT come on, a mile away, risen above all the waves like an island un the sea, the buggest wave ever I looked upon. The 3 mates stood together and watched UT come on, a pryin' like we thought she would no break un pass on us. But UT was no Tollby. At the last, when she rose up like a mountain, curlin' above the stern and blottin' out the sky, the mates scattered, the second and third run none for the mizzen shrouds and climben up, but the first run none Toll the will Toll lend a hond. He was a brave man, thought Samuel Hennon. He run straight un Toll the face o thought father o all waves, no thunkin' on himself but thunkin' only o the shup. The 2 men was lashed Toll the wheel, but he would be ready Toll hond un the case they was colt. And then she took UT. We on the house could no see the poop for the 1,000 tons o water thought hot UT. Thought wave cleaned them out, took everything along with UT, the 2 mates, climben up the mizzen ruggen, Samuel Hennon run none Toll the wheel, the 2 men at the wheel, aye, and the wheel itself. We never saw aught o them, for she broached Toll what o the wool gown, and 2 men o us was drownded off the house. No Toll mention the carpenter thought we pucked up at the break o the poop worth every bone o whose body broke Toll he was like so much jelly. And here enters the marvel of it, the miraculous wonder of that woman's heroic spirit. Margaret Hennon was 47 when the news came home of the loss of Samuel, and it was not long after that the unbelievable rumor went around Island McGill. I say unbelievable. Island McGill would not believe. Dr. Hall pooh-poohed it. Everybody laughed at it as a good joke. They traced back the gossip to Saradak, servant to the Hennons, and who alone lived with Margaret and her husband. But Saradak persisted in her assertion and was called a low-mouthed liar. One or two dared question Tom Hennon himself, but beyond black looks and curses for their presumption they elicited nothing from him. The rumor died down, and the island fell to discussing in all its ramifications the loss of the Grenoble in the China Seas, with all her officers and half her crew born and married on Island McGill. But the rumor would not stay down. Saradak was louder in her assertions, the looks Tom Hennon cast about him were blacker than ever, and Dr. Hall, after a visit to the Hennon house, no longer poot-poot. Then Island McGill sat up, and there was a tremendous wagging of tongues. It was unnatural and ungodly. The like had never been heard. And when, as time passed, the truth of Saradak's utterances was manifest, the island folk decided, like the BOSN of the Starry Grace, that only the devil could have had a hand in so untoward a happening. And the infatuated woman, so Saradak reported, insisted that it would be a boy. 11 bairns ha I born, she said, 6 o' them losses and 5 o' them loddies. And since there be balance all thungs, so will there be balance wuth me. 6 o' one and half a dozen o' the other, there use either balance, an ounce sure ounce the sun rises the marnan, thought sure will ut be a boy. And boy it was, and a prodigy. Dr. Hall raved about its unblemished perfection and massive strength, and wrote a brochure on it for the Dublin Medical Society as the most interesting case of the sort in his long career. When Saradak gave the babes unbelievable weight, Island McGill refused to believe and once again called her liar. But when Dr. Hall attested that he had himself weighed it and seen it tip that very notch, Island McGill held its breath and accepted whatever report Saradak made of the infant's progress or appetite. And once again Margaret Hennon carried a babe to Belfast and had it christened Samuel. Ounce good ounce gold ut was, said Saradak to me. Sarah, at the time I met her, was a buxom, phlegmatic spinster of 60, equipped with an experience so tragic and unusual that though her tongue ran on for decades its output would still be of imperishable interest to her cronies. Ounce good, said Saradak. Ut never fretted. Sut ut down the sun by the hour and never a sound ut would make ounce long ounce ut was no hungered. And thought strong. The grappo at Hons was like a mons. I mind me, when ut was but hours old, ut grupped me so mighty thought I fetched a scream I was thought frightened. Ut was the punk o' health. Ut slept and ate, and grew. Ut never bothered. Never a night's sleep ut lost toll no one, nor ever a minutes, and thought wuth cut tinuts teeth and all. And Margaret would dandle ut on her knee and ask was there ever so fine a loddy the 3 kingdoms. The way ut grew. Ut was keepon wuth the way ut ate. Ot a year ut was the size o' a bairn of 2. Ut was slow tull walk and talk. Except in 4 gurgly noises ut's throat and 4 creepon on all fours, ut dudna monage much the walkin' and talkin' line. But thought was toll be expected from the way ut grew. Ut all went toll grow strong and healthy. And even old Tom Hennon cheered up at the might of ut and said was there ever the like o ut the 3 kingdoms. Ut was Dr. Hall thought first suspicioned, I mind me well, though ut was little I dreamt what he was up tull at the time. I see hum holden thungs fronto luttle Sammy's eyes, and amarcoon noises, loud and soft, and far and near, luttle Sammy's ears. And then I see Dr. Hall go away, Runclin whose eyebrows and shaken whose head like the bairn was Iluan. But he was no Iluan, ounce I could swear tull, me ac and hummeaton grow. But Dr. Hall no said a word tull Margaret and I was no for guessin' the why he was sore puzzled. I mind me when Luttle Sammy first spoke. He was 2 years old and the size of a child o' 5, though he could no manage the walkin' yet but went around on all fours, happy and contented like and Marcoon no trouble ounce long ounce he was fed promptly, which was unusual often. I was hanged the wash on the line at the time when out he comes, on all fours, whose bug head waggun tull and fro and blunken the sun. And then, sudden, he talked. I was thought to K back I near died o' fright, and fine I knew UT then, the shaken o' Dr. Hall's head. Talked. Never a bairn on Island McGill talked so loud and told such purpose. There was no mustakin UT. I stood there all tremblin' and shaken. Little Sammy was Brian. I tell you, sir, he was Brian like an ass, just like thought, loud and long and cheerful tull UT seemed whose lungs you'd crack. He was a idiot, a great, awful, monster idiot. UT was after he talked thought Dr. Hall told Margaret, but she would no believe. UT would all come right, she said. UT was growing too fast for aught else. Gov UT time, said she, and we would see. But old Tom Hennon knew, and he never held up whose head again. He could no abide the thung, and would no brung humsail tull touch UT, though I am no denune he was fair fascinated by UT mony the time. I see hum watchun of UT around a corner, lookin' at UT tull whose eyes fair bulged with the horror, and when UT braid old Tom you'd stuck whose fungus tull whose ears and look thought miserable I could a putted hum. And bray UT could. UT was the only thing UT could do besides eat and grow. Whenever UT was hungry UT brayed, and there was no stop on UT save with food. And always of a marnun, when first UT crawled tull the kitchen door and blunked out at the sun, UT brayed. And UT was Brian that brought about ut's end. I mind me well. UT was 3 years old and ounce bug ounce a lead o' 10. Old Tom had been gown from bed tull worse, ploughin' up and down the fields and talkin' and mutterin' tull himself. On the marnun o' the day I mind me, he was suttin' on the bench outside the kitchen, a futtin' the handle tull a puckaxe. Unbeknown, the monster idiot crawled tull the door and brayed after whose fashion at the sun. I see old Tom start up and look. And there was the monster idiot, wag gunnuts bug head and blunkin' and Brian like the great buggus UT was. UT was too much for Tom. Something went wrong with hum sudden like. He jumped tull his feet and fetched the puck handle down on the monster idiot's head. And he hut UT again and again like UT was a mud dog and hum afeared o' UT. And he went straight tull the stable and hung humsail tull a rafter. And I was no for stop pun on after such like, and I went tull stay along with me sister thought was married tull John Martin and comfortable off. I sat on the bench by the kitchen door and regarded Margaret Hennon, while with her callous thumb she pressed down the live fire of her pipe and gazed out across the twilight-sombered fields. It was the very bench Tom Hennon had sat upon that last sanguinary day of life. And Margaret sat in the doorway where the monster, blinking at the sun, had so often wagged its head and brayed. We had been talking for an hour, she with that slow certitude of eternity that so befitted her, and, for the life of me, I could lay no finger on the motives that ran through the tangled warp and woof of her. Was she a martyr to truth? Did she have it in her to worship at so abstract a shrine? Had she conceived abstract truth to be the one high goal of human endeavor on that day of long ago when she named her firstborn Samuel? Or was hers the stubborn obstinacy of the ox? The fixity of purpose of the balky horse? The stolidity of the self-willed peasant mind? Was it whim or fancy? The one streak of lunacy in what was otherwise an eminently rational mind? Or, reverting, was hers the spirit of a Bruno? Was she convinced of the intellectual rightness of the stance she had taken? Was hers a steady, enlightened opposition to superstition? Or, and a subtler thought, was she mastered by some vaster, profounder superstition, a fetish worship of which the Alpha and the Omega was the cryptic Samuel? Will ye be tellin' me, she said, thought of the second Samuel had been named Larry thought he would no have fell you in the hot water and drowned. Atween you and me, sir, and ye are intelligent lookin' tull the eye, would the name have made UT onyways different? Would there was hun no be done thought day if he had been Larry or Michael? Would hot water no be hot, and would hot water no burn if he had one other name but Samuel? I acknowledged the justice of her contention, and she went on. Do a wee bit of a name change the plans o' God? Do the world run by hut or muss, and be God a week, surely young creature thought you'd alter the fate and destiny o' thungs because the worm Margaret Hennen seen fut tull name her bairn Samuel. There be my son Jamie. He will no sign a Russian fun un whose crew because o believen thought Russian funs do be monage on the ones and hof the marcoon o bod weather. Will you be thunken so? Will you be thunken thought God thought makes the ones tull blow will bend whose head from on high tull loosen tull the word o a greasy Russian fun un some dirty shops forecastle. I said no, certainly not, but she was not to be set aside from pressing home the point of her argument. Then will you be thunken thought God thought directs the stars un their courses, and tull whose mighty foot the world usey but a footstool. Will you be thunken thought he will take a spite again Margaret Hennen and send a bug wave off the cape tull wash her son un tull eternity, all because she was phenomen hum Samuel. But why Samuel? I asked. And thought I dinna know. I wanted ut so. But why did you want it so? An easy ut me thought would be answer on a such like question. Be there one mon Leuven or dead thought can answer. Who can tell the whyo like? My Jamie was fair daft on buttermilk, he would drunk ut tull, ounce he said himself, whose back teeth was awash. But my Timothy could no abide buttermilk. I like tull loosen tull the thunder growl on an ROA run, and rampajoon. My Katie could no abide the noise of ut, but must scream and flutter and go run none for the mud most o a featherbed. Never yet have I heard the answer tull the whyo like, God alone has thought answer. You and me be mortal and we canna know. Enough for us tull know what we like and what we do's like. I like thought usey the first word and the last. And behind thought like no men can go and find the whyout. I like Samuel, and I like ut well. Ut usey a sweet name, and there be a rollin' wonder un the sound o ut thought passes understand and dot. The twilight deepened, and in the silence I gazed upon that splendid dome of a forehead which time could not mar, at the width between the eyes, and at the eyes themselves, clear, outlooking, and wide-seeing. She rose to her feet with an air of dismissing me, saying, Ut will be a dark walk home, and there will be more thon a sprunkle o wet un the sky. Have you any regrets, Margaret Hennen? I asked, suddenly and without forethought. She studied me a moment. I thought I know her born another son. And you would? I faltered. I thought I would, she answered. Ut would ha been whose name? I went down the dark road between the hawthorn hedges puzzling over the why of like, repeating Samuel to myself and aloud and listening to the rolling wonder in its sound that had charmed her soul and led her life in tragic places. Samuel. There was a rolling wonder in the sound. There was.